Hello, everyone, and welcome to the conclusion episode of Her Hollywood Unscripted, a podcast that explores the struggles, triumphs, and unheard voices of women in Hollywood. Today, you have a different host than usual. I'm your host, Cindy Stanfill, and today I'm turning the microphone around to interview my daughter, Emma Stanfill. Over the school year, Emma has dedicated herself to researching the challenges women face in Hollywood and how women's solidarity has propelled their success in an industry historically dominated by men. Today, I'll be asking Emma about everything she's learned during her research in connection with her interviews. We'll dive into themes of resilience, solidarity, and ways women have fought not just to survive, but thrive. So let's get started.
Thank you so much for hosting. I'm so excited to tell you all about my research and my interviews, especially since you worked in the industry. So this is such a cool interview.
Of course, I'm really excited about the conversation. I'd love to start off by asking what things surprised you about each of these interviews?
There were so many things that surprised me and things I learned through these conversations. I think the most important thing I learned was how complex this issue is and how truly large Hollywood is. In my research, I learned that it's the second largest industry next to aeronautics. But I think really talking to these women just showed me how many different roles there are in the industry and how different every single one is. For example, the experience of a makeup artist working at Warner Brothers is going to be totally different than a writer working on a Shondaland production. And that experience is going to be so different than an agent working for the creative artist agency. So you really can't make blanket statements about what things are like for women in Hollywood or in any industry. Not to mention all the different backgrounds they all bring. So every experience is so different. And each woman I talked to added nuance to the conversation. Something significant that I researched was CAA's 50-50 by 2020 initiative, where they essentially said by the year 2020, they wanted to have equal representation of men and women, and they didn't meet this goal. And that idea connected a lot to my interviews. I was really surprised by both my conversations with Corinne and Dawn, who talked about how common it was in writers' rooms to have a diversity hire and a woman hire.
So you'd have a staff of 12, and I'd say 10 were men, one was a woman, and one was a diversity hire, without a doubt. You'd have the token woman in the room, then token diversity hire. My agent would call me and say, you know what, they've already got a woman in their room.
And he said, they haven't found their woman yet. Like, it was like, it's an understanding that there's an obligation to hire a woman, and they are trying to fulfill that quota.
So in a room of 12 people, only 2 diverse perspectives is really crazy when you're trying to tell stories that reach such large and diverse audiences. So that was really surprising to me. And I kind of left those conversations with Dawn and Corinne and even Sybil so surprised, and it changed my perspective on CAA and their intentions behind announcing that initiative. Are they trying to just advertise that their company is working towards diversity to protect brand identity and meet a quota, or are they really all about amplifying minority voices? So I was kind of upset to hear that it wasn't as simple as I had chalked it up to be. But then in my final interview with Tracy, who actually works for CAA, she said that about a year ago, a Latino group was formed within CAA for the community to come together and brainstorm how they could be more progressive about amplifying voices within the Latinx community.
We have within CAA, there's a CAA Latino group that was started about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And so we meet regularly and highlight within our group because it's a cross agency group.
And she joined it, which I thought was so amazing. And that added nuance to my perspective again. So yes, maybe they feel obligated to have a diverse range of hires, but there's also so many people within the industry really fighting to change the composition of these rooms. I also knew how beneficial women's solidarity was. That's what my whole literature review was about. But I was really surprised how few women knew about organized groups for women or minorities in the industry.
Well, at the time, I had no idea of any women-run groups.
But no, in terms of any other organized, like, female-focused groups, I haven't had. We just they've been sort of organically formed.
From my conversations with these women, it sounded like there were probably groups, but they didn't really know about them. But a lot of them felt really empowered by forming informal social networks.
But we would just have lunch together in my office, which we called the Estro Den.
Corinne talked about her Estro Den, and by each of them rallying together like that, they still had a community in women's solidarity, and it was equally as powerful as an organized group, which was something I hadn't even considered. And they all had great female mentors too, which was so awesome to hear.
I do believe it's all these women that have given me the green light, which has been really heartening.
She's a big, big, big person in my life, and I love the female mentors I've had in my life, and those two are my biggest.
I was also surprised about the prevalence of the maternal wall in all of these personal stories.
I remember being interviewed for a job, and this male producer said to me, "Didn't you just have a baby?" And I said, "Well, yeah, like 12 months ago. And he's like, "Well, you can't be coming back to work so soon." And I was like, "Excuse me?"
Because I just had a gut feeling that I wasn't going to be asked for the next season, saying that I was pregnant and probably going to have to take maternity leave.
Firmly believe that men are less likely to be questioned about family obligations, sort of allowing them to maybe pursue opportunities more freely. So he said to us, "Don't worry, you guys are going to be just fine. Johnny, you're going to go out and you're going to be running a studio someday. And Cindy, you're going to get married and have babies." That was really young in my career, and I wasn't talking about babies.
I definitely was sort of very nervous to have children because I did feel in my position, I just was in meetings privy where people would sort of, especially in the agency world, but people would say, "Oh, well, so-and-so's going to be on maternity leave, or we should really, focus on trying to, hit on their clients because they're going to be gone."
My research really did align with many of these stories, which was exciting to see how accurate my research was, but at the same time, so disappointing to hear all of these disheartening stories about the industry that were true. And I was shocked how many women were not promoted or didn't get the job because of motherhood, and how it played into so many aspects of their work. But I think this just leads me to say that I'm not at all surprised, but I was truly so inspired by the sacrifices these women made, like breastfeeding at work or at award shows. And the multitasking these women were able to do was overall so impressive. There were just so many things that surprised me about these interviews, but I think overall I was just genuinely so impressed and inspired by each of these women.
Wow, those are really interesting points that you brought up. One theme that came up in many of the interviews for this podcast was the idea of women having to prove themselves twice as hard as their male counterparts. How does that resonate with your own research? And what did you find out about how women push through that barrier?
Some really compelling research I found was Ensure's 2002 study that said a survey of 461 women executives and 325 women CEOs indicated that consistently exceeding performance standards was the number one strategy for breaking the glass ceiling. And I think that came up a lot in my interviews about women trying to prove competence, but also just exceed the standards that were set for them.
When you go on set, if it's the exact same show and you're the exact same person, but you're a man, people who will see you as a showrunner, as a man, and assume competence. And she's like, and because you're a woman, just because you're a woman, you will have to prove competence.
Tracy Brennan was a great interview, and she talked a lot about blinders and how you sometimes have to just drown out the noise of the industry.
Imagine myself in the starting blocks with the blinders on, and I remind myself that I am only competing with myself. I just think you have to charge ahead. If you don't believe in yourself, nobody else is going to believe in you.
She was told by another agent that was male.
And he said, "You're never going to make it. You're way too nice."
And if she had listened to that, she wouldn't have gotten where she was today. And Corinne had an amazing quote about having to prove yourself twice as hard and how it's not fair, but you just have to be resilient. And ultimately she was, and then found great success. And Dion even had to withstand sexual harassment, which is just crazy for me to hear about. But it's so admirable that she still pushed through that inappropriate experience and still had such great success and works alongside men and is often the boss of many men. And so I think persistence was just a really key theme. But in my interview with you, you said the biggest piece of advice was to advocate for yourself and not be afraid to take up space in the room.
Don't ever apologize for it. Know your worth and speak up about your ideas.
And when you hear a lot of these success stories, that's exactly what women did. So I think there's definitely a balance of being persistent and pushing through, but also setting boundaries and advocating for yourself about what's right. I think that Dion demanded equal pay when her male counterpart was getting paid more than her.
But later on in my career, when he and I were both at a very big network together, I knew he was getting like $12,000 more. Like, not in your best interest to complain, but you find another way. Like, ultimately, I do feel like I got paid fairly down the road. I just had to bounce around and go to other places to get higher rates and then come back and say, this is my rate and this is what I deserve to be paid.
Which was huge. Corinne asked David E. Kelley to read her scripts. And of course, she was so nervous about asking one of the greatest writers of all time to read her scripts, and because that opened her up to be very vulnerable, but she advocated for herself and ultimately worked out for her. Dawn had to stand up for herself in all male dominated rooms. Sybil had to compromise with directors to make sure parts of her identity she wanted to come through were seen. And you even had to tell your boss that you needed to go home early on Fridays to care for your child. So I think there's just something to be said about the power of standing up for yourself, but also pushing through situations where maybe you're getting belittling comments, but you're still pushing through that.
Yeah, it really was tough to set those boundaries. And I think it's really important that women do set those boundaries so that they can be persistent in a healthy environment. How do you see women's solidarity play out in the stories of women you interview for the podcast?
I think there was a really common theme among other women talking about how they only felt like they could truly help empower other women once they were in a spot where they were kind of more stable.
I'm in a position where I can hire people, or I can recommend people to be hired. And but when I was first starting, it was like, yeah, you're just trying to get the job yourself, so you can't really bring anybody with you at that point.
And I don't think it's until you get to a certain level of power that you can really be like, okay, I'm gonna give a hand to the next female on the staff, or, help them out and become that mentor.
One had established themselves in the industry, because when you're just getting into the industry, you're oftentimes in competition with a lot of other women fighting for maybe that one spot in a writer's room. And so I think something that connected a lot to my research with Lois Weber, who was a blind spot in American history, and she helped advocate for women, direct movies, write complex roles for women, and uplift them. And I think that's just a great example of women's solidarity, and how once you're in a certain position, you can then help younger women make a smoother transition into the industry than maybe you did. And I think Dionne played into this a lot as well. She talked about kind of paying it forward and helping to empower young women in the industry once she was pretty established as a producer. And nearly every woman I talked to had a strong female mentor that paved the way for them, which I think is huge. Sybil talked a lot about how in order to be it, you have to see it. And I think for women in the industry, that's huge, to be able to see a woman in a leading role that you maybe want to take on someday. You then know it's possible. So I think that there are so many examples of women's solidarity and how they were helping to empower each other and just finding comfort in each other, which was amazing to hear.
Yeah, I agree. Those are really great examples of women's solidarity. Why was it important to interview a variety of women ranging in age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and different backgrounds?
I think it's so important. I think even the really difficult part of researching for my literature review was that you hear the statistic that from 1998 to 2024, women have only taken 22% of leading roles like directing, producing, acting, and leading films. And there's only been a 5% increase over the last 26 years, which seems small, but to make a blanket statement for that's the case for all women is just kind of inaccurate, because those numbers don't account for Black female directors or Asian female directors or any minority women that are even behind those already low numbers. Overall, it's important to acknowledge that women as a whole are three-dimensional, complex, and all bring different assets of their intersectionality to the industry. So by talking to a more diverse group of women, I was able to get a better feel for what it's like for them and each obstacle they faced. And I think another important component is age. For Sybil, who is transitioning into writing, being an older female, because she did dancing and acting before this point, has been really difficult for her.
I think, Hollywood has an ageist issue.
She's really relied on other female mentors. So I think that experience is going to be different than a younger writer getting into the industry. And something I found really interesting was the overlap of female-led rooms also leading to more diverse rooms.
First writer's room was on a Shondaland show, so it didn't look like I think most rooms looked like. Like, we had maybe a majority women, majority people of color. I do recall being surprised and delighted at the composition of the room. But I have heard from other writers who have been in the game for a long time that our room was not a typical room. So
Sybil talked about how her first writer's room was on a Shondaland production. And when you have a Black female leader, it led to a very diverse and comfortable space for her. And she was so pleased to see the composition of the room being so diverse. And I think my research also supported this when the Screen Actors Guild Women's Committee head chairman Kathleen Nolan was able to advocate for not only women performers, but also other groups who were excluded from the business. So the Screen Actors Guild even created an agreement with production companies that favored productions who hired women, minorities, seniors, and disabled performers. So I think that it's just so important to see how women, because they have been in the position of being a minority group and being excluded from Hollywood, they then champion the causes of other groups who are also excluded. So overall, I think that it's just so important to talk to a diverse array of women because they all have such different experiences, and those unique experiences can help me understand the industry better.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, it's awesome to hear women champion those causes. So you've mentioned sexual harassment. I know sexual harassment is something that's been deeply ingrained in Hollywood for decades. What patterns did you notice between the women you interviewed in terms of how they've navigated or confronted harassment in the workplace?
I think it's truly so sad how many women have been put in uncomfortable and inappropriate positions at work. But I think the general theme was optimism. And so many of these women that came forward about these experiences say, I was put in that position, but that would never fly now. I think this is largely due to the Me Too movement, which a lot of my research was centered around, which nearly every woman on the podcast acknowledged that changed the climate of the industry.
Absolutely can think of specific circumstances that I had to deal with before pre-Me Too that would never fly now. And there is a comfort in knowing I would not have to endure that. I would not have to help a friend who's enduring that because there's just not the tolerance for it isn't there.
I definitely experienced sexual harassment in a very extreme way there. I think what was acceptable in the 80s is not acceptable now, and 95% of the people know that. And if they cross that line, they know that they're going to be hearing from human resources.
So that was such a powerful act of women's solidarity that made the workplace a safer place for women now, because there's intimacy coordinators and there's so many new positions that make women feel comfortable on set, so that people like Harvey Weinstein, who are, even if they're a big wig, powerful person in Hollywood, they could still never get away with that. So I think that there's power in numbers for sure. And it shows that change for women can happen in solidarity with one another.
Absolutely. I think women's solidarity is huge. I'd love to hear some of the advice that women gave about navigating Hollywood. Were there overlaps?
Each of these women gave so many amazing pieces of advice that ultimately left me feeling really empowered. And I think that they could be applied to many industries that women work in. There were a few general themes for the advice. Your advice was amazing about advocating for yourself and taking up spaces in rooms. A lot of women talked about not being afraid to take risks, because it is scary, especially if you're the only woman in a room full of men, to put yourself out there. But it sounded like the payoff was really great for women who took these risks. Tracy gave me the amazing piece of advice to put your blinders on. If she had just quit after someone told her that she was too nice and would never make it, she would have never been where she is today. And so I think each of these women have all been told belittling comments, but they worked so hard in spite of that. And I think that's just a great piece of advice, that there's going to be a lot of noise in whatever industry you're in. But if you can block that out and put your head down and work hard, there's a lot of success that comes from that. There was also a big authenticity factor. A lot of women advised me that your otherness makes you an asset.
You know what? There's enough artists out there that maybe want something different, or maybe relate to me because I am different, and not just try to be a carbon copy of everybody else, because then you are a fish out of water, then you are being faux.
And Tracy talked about how when she was first in the industry, she even tried to kind of dress like her male counterparts. She had a really short haircut because she felt like if she could look the part than she could be the part.
And I think I was suppressing who I was and trying to blend and fit in and look more like my male counterparts, because I thought, well, they're successful. Maybe this is what I should be doing, and try to be part of the boy club or fit in that way. But I think as I grew more confident and found, made my way in my career, I started to realize that I shouldn't try to compete with men or other people.
And I think now she's obviously changed that narrative, and she's doing so much for the Latinx community. And I think that's huge. I think Sybil talked about this as well. Your authenticity and your otherness is huge. And that's something that you bring to the table that no one else can bring to the table. And another practical piece of advice was the financial component. A lot of the writers said to always keep writing.
To keep writing for anything and anyone that you can. The smallest job can be turned into the biggest job.
Write what enlivens you, write what thrills you, write what breaks your heart. And in that, when it's coming from a really true, pure place, I think a real voice emerges, and that's what gets people's attention.
You can do that when you're poor. You can do that when you're rich. You can do that at home. You can do that at work, which was an awesome piece of advice for aspiring screenwriters. They said to be smart with your money, because they did talk about how it's kind of an unpredictable career.
One of the best things I think about this industry is your life could change on any day. You have no idea when you're going to get that call saying yeah, you got the job, you're staffed on the show, or yeah, your pilot's getting picked up, we're going to shoot it. At any moment your life can change, which is thrilling. If you're looking for stability and predictability, it's not the career.
Have a lot of savings, be smart with your money, save as much money as you can.
It's so thrilling that your life could change overnight, but it's also your show could get canceled. So you have to be smart with your money. And once you've established yourself, set boundaries about the pay you're deserving of. Dionne said that her male counterpart was making a bunch more money to do the same role, and they had the same experience. So I think it's important to, again, advocate for yourself. And then ultimately, they also advised that patience. They were all in positions where it was frustrating at times. And they were like, why is this woman seeing success, but I'm not? And so I think it's important to have patience and know, obviously, in any industry, when you get right in, you're not going to be the top dog right away, but you have to work hard. And if you're patient and your dedication and commitment pay off, your time will come to be really successful and then empower other women.
Absolutely. That's all really great advice. And I'm just wondering, how did the maternal wall come up in your conversations? And also, how did the women you spoke with manage the balancing act between family life and the demanding nature of Hollywood?
A lot of my research was from Joan C. Williams, who is kind of an expert on gender bias in Hollywood. And she talked about how mothers face the stereotype directly, and even women who choose not to have children also faced reduced promotion rates. And I think I heard a lot of personal experiences surrounding this. For example, your story that you told me with you and your assistant, and basically the studio was under turmoil, and your boss said, don't worry, you guys will both be fine. Your assistant will go run a company someday. He'll get promoted. It'll be great. And you'll go get married and start a family. And you hadn't even had conversations about starting a family yet. So that's just an example where we can see the maternal wall at play, because you're not being promoted at the same rate that he's being promoted just because you're a female. And I also had research from Taparia and Lenka that argue that social norms also create organizational barriers in the form of think manager, think male. And that stereotype you saw directly play out in your work, because just because your assistant was a male, it was assumed that he would have competence and that he would make for a good leader. But as we've heard from so many conversations throughout this podcast, there are so many amazing, amazing female bosses out there. I also think it's just so admirable, the sacrifices that women have made to keep their role in the industry. Tracy even talked about how she had kids later because she was worried that it would stunt her career. But ultimately, when she did have children, so many women did rally around her. And she talked about how it truly takes a village to do everything that she does. She luckily has a supportive husband and a great female community around her in the industry. And Dawn, she was breastfeeding while winning a Writers Guild Award, which is just like the most amazing thing. And Dionne worked for 12 years as a mother, also navigating the industry. So I think a common theme also was that female bosses can combat the maternal wall because they can make environments for women that are very accommodating, and they can get them out of there at normal hours and have great success. Obviously, Shonda Rhimes has amazing success, and she made environments that women felt comfortable in, that women felt like they could function in and have a healthy environment. And I think that's huge. So I do think that female leadership is one way to, after my conversations, to combat the maternal wall.
These are all really amazing stories. I think female bosses can be really powerful and can create accommodating environments for mothers in the industry. I'm really curious, from all of these interviews, are you walking away feeling hopeful or discouraged about the industry? And what do you want people to take away from this podcast?
I think all of my research and all of my interviews combined have made me realize that women's climb to the top is tough, especially in such a male-dominated space where sometimes men can be, not all, but some men can be belittling and sexist. And systems are really tough to dismantle, especially since these companies make so much money and they often have male leadership that maybe they don't want to expose these women's voices who are coming out and speaking about their experiences. Corinne, Dion, Dawn, you all said to just stick it through, which I think obviously that shows that there is great reward, even in sometimes these challenging situations. I think something really interesting to bring up is that CAA has to approve all media that goes out, and they wouldn't approve my final episode, or it would have taken months. And the head of media is male. These systems are really tough, and especially when media that's put out to the public is all approved by some sort of team. So they are giving you media that they want you to hear about. But overall, each of the women that I interviewed were honestly so amazing, and the resilience to push through was so admirable, and the payoff seemed really great. They all had the fondest memories, and all thought their job was so exciting.
And when the big idea comes to life, for you and the people that had this vision, it's the most exciting thing, and it's all I want to do.
It's very exciting and creatively invigorating.
And we won a Writers Guild Award that night. It was pretty crazy.
The different groups that you worked with on a show, they literally became like family. You worked hard, you laughed together, you made strong connections. We shared all our meals together, practically. We celebrated the success of the show. So that community and that family feeling, that was just amazing. It was like some of the most fun years of my life.
And you could hear their smiles through the Zoom call. So ultimately, it seems like every job, it's an absolute hustle, but the reward is totally worth the risk, which was really inspiring for me to hear.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this has been so interesting and inspiring, even for me. And I was part of the industry. And it's been so much fun having the chance to interview you and hear about all the powerful insights that you've gained through your research and your interviews.
Yeah, I hope these conversations inspire all of us to continue pushing for change and advocating for equality and just uplifting the voices of women everywhere. Hollywood is so huge and so influential to cultural attitudes. So I hope that these women's voices really shed light on things you wouldn't hear very often, but also inspired you, because I know it certainly did for me. I was already inspired by my mom's stories that I would hear growing up, but then to hear how resilient all of these women were just made me honestly proud to be a woman and proud to be raised in an era where people value making changes that open up new spaces and perspectives and expand the diversity of the experiences we see and hear in every room. So thank you for joining us on Her Hollywood Unscripted. We appreciate you being part of the conversation wherever you're listening from. And until next time, keep breaking those barriers.